All right, so that's a debate, and I will be defending that mesh should be used in most paraesophageal hernia repairs. And those are my disclosures. Again, no conflict of interest.
We are going to the debate first, for anyone who's looking at the program. We'll pull some of the other talks for a little bit.
So I think just as a background, it's worth talking about two of the studies that are considered the gold standard in repair of paraesophageal hernia. This is from Dr. Pearson's group, 94 patients who had transthoracic repair of large paraesophageal hernias. 80% of them had a college gastroplasty. Mesh was not used, and they had the reoperation rate of 2% in 72 months. So pretty good results. The next gold standard manuscript is Dr. Lukatich's manuscript, 662 patients with paraesophageal hernias. 63% of those had cholecystroplasty, but as we heard before, that rate has decreased over the years. 13% of them had a mesh repair, radiological recurrence of 15.7%, and a reoperation rate of 3.2% at a median follow-up of 22 months. So if you carefully look at every other hernia in the body and every other hernia guidelines, all of them, mesh is recommended for repair. Inguinal hernia, ventral hernia, you say it, and it's there. You should use hernia. It has been shown to decrease recurrences and reoperations. What about in thoracic surgery? What about or not in thoracic surgery? What about in paraesophageal hernias? So those are the 4 randomized studies that had more than 50 patients in them. The first one from 2002, using a non-absorbable mesh. Primary closure, the recurrence rate was 22%. And if you look at the mesh recurrence, that was 0%. And I will give it to Ginny that has not been reproduced, perhaps, but that's the data presented. Another study in 2005, 100 patients, and those are all laparoscopic era, by the way. Another non-absorbable mesh, primary closure recurrence of 26% compared to 8% in those with mesh. Finally, maybe the most quoted study is Oschlager's study. A lot of pretty good surgeons from the West Coast participated in this study. 108 patients, and the initial result, and I'm going to show you it a little later, showed that patients who had hernia, and those were absorbable hernias, had lower recurrence rate. When they did a follow-up on that study 5 years later, that difference had disappeared, and both groups had recurrence. But it is worth noting that from the 108 patients that started the study, data was available for only 65 patients in 5 years. So hard to judge. And finally, the only negative randomized study comparing hernia to no hernia was from 2015. Use a combination. Some patients had, it was really a 3-arm study, and one arm was absorbable mesh, the CIS, and one arm was the tie mesh, and then it was the no mesh. And then for analysis, they ended up grouping all of the hernias, and here there was no difference. Looking back at the Oschlager study, you can see that there are only 60 patients in the late follow-up. And granted that result was not statistically significant, but I'm not even sure that that was a valid result to start with, since almost half of the patients weren't there on the follow-up analysis. If you look at large meta-analysis, and there are 2 of them, this one, and this is the risk of recurrence, had a odds ratio of 0.55, meaning 45% decrease in recurrence rate on the group that used mesh. Another meta-analysis, and this was done here by an ex-faculty here, Katie, was the senior author on this study, showed that patients who had mesh, the recurrence rate was decreased with a pretty significant p-value of 0.014. And maybe there was a trend towards less reoperation. So the conclusion of the study was, until studies are available, the evidence to support routine use of mesh, cruroplasty, and laparoscopic repair of large hiatal hernia is weak and cannot be recommended. However, I would submit to you that there is a little cognitive dissonance here in which they go against their own results when they say that, well, we showed that it's better, but well, the evidence is weak. So I'm sorry Katie's not here, because that will be fun to see her after. Yeah. Now, again, data from University of Pittsburgh, which a lot of people may use to say, oh, you know, hernia is no good and maybe it's worse. So this study looks at the 13% of patients that had mesh cruroplasty versus primary closure. And the point of the study is that patients that had mesh cruroplasty actually had a higher recurrence. But is that really true? So here you have a group that doesn't necessarily believes in hernia, in mesh. So when did they put the mesh? Well, they put the mesh when everything looked terrible. So those patients were already at a very high risk of recurrence. They were a different group of patients. Then you apply the mesh and they recur more, and now we're blaming the mesh. So granted, I think that there are many questions that still remain on mesh. What type of biologic? How to place it? Should it be a keyhole? Or maybe just a little patch over the sutures? Or maybe over both the right and the left crura? And we don't know. We don't know the answer. We don't even know if this makes a difference. But I think the combined evidence shows that there is an improved in recurrence rate. And again, why do hiatal hernia recur? And I'll give it again to Ginny, who probably talked about that. Yes, I agree. Probably unrecognized short esophagus would be the #1 cause on those large paraesophageal hernias. Hiatal closure under tension, that may be another cause, and perhaps mesh would help here. Maybe intrinsic collagen or allicin metabolism or inadequate cruise support, and mesh can help here as well. The short esophagus is not recognized, and I'm not going to talk too much about this, but again, sometimes you mobilize all the way up, and I showed this before, you still have an esophagus that's short. Yeah. So that's one of the things. But how many times we fix the short esophagus, we do the collis gastroplasty, and the hernia still recurs? So that obviously not the only problem and not the only cause of hernia recurrence. So to avoid recurrence, assess for short esophagus. I think everybody here will say it over and over again. Tension-free cruroplasty using the pneumothorax technique that Dr. Lukatic described that I still use today, or relaxing incision that some people swear by, and finally the use of biological mesh. And I will also get out of the way, Jeannie, that mesh that is inside the stomach. Well, does it happen? Yes. Does it happen with biological mesh? No. So those are the non-absorbable mesh that often erode into the G junction or esophagus, causing a pretty big problem. And you know, I still remember a case from when I was a fellow here. A relatively young guy came from New York with a severe dysphagia, and a piece of Gore-Tex mesh eroded into his esophagus. I mean, he ended up with an esophagectomy, did well, but yes, it's a problem. But again, most would not recommend using a non-absorbable mesh by the esophagus because of this problem. So, in conclusion, I believe that available data supports the routine use of mesh in paraesophageal hernia repair. Thank you. Oh, facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence.
Thank you, Sophocles. Dr. Lytle will be giving the counter argument.